Beautiful. Thank you. Do I have to wear this? Just like that? What's that? You can go all the way down. Set some mood lighting. Hello? Can you hear me okay? Is that good?
Yeah. We're going to turn off the lights for this presentation.
All right. How's that, everybody? Who helped with the dongle there? Abby. Abby, let's hear it for Abby. Woo! You guys, you made it all the way to the end. This is the end of Wordcamp. I'm happy to be here, and this isn't going to be quite as technical as some of the other talks. This is going to be about color, and so I hope you guys like color. But thanks to Jamie and the other organizers for having me here, and this is fun. So that's my face. A little squishy, maybe? Is that a little squishy? All right, that's fine. Oh, you can't see me? Are you working on the squishiness?
No, I'm working on your mic.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, maybe it's just my angle down here. Anyway, so if I look familiar to you, it might be because of this animated GIF. That it took me 9 months to make this animated GIF, and so like I grew this beard out and then like I had this idea like, oh, you know, I could do this and make this GIF, and then my friend Alex decided that he would post it to Reddit, and it turns out that it topped Reddit GIFs that day, and then it was on the front page of College Humor, and then if you search Giphy, you'll actually find my face. If you search for hipster or beard, you'll find me. Oh, the same is true for Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn. So I'm just a regular guy. That I know this is a little overwhelming, but so I am an independent designer. I span a lot of different things with design. That I like working on the strategy side of things and the experience side and the visual side. So anything from branding to UX and UI, I like touching all of that stuff. That's really exciting to me, to be in the place where it's the middle, right? And so recently I went on my own to be an independent designer. But before that, I worked at a technology company called Hudl. Is people familiar with Hudl here? Great. I was a design director there, and before that, I worked on a social media sort of techie thing called PAC. It was for people who love their dogs. I'm not joking. And then before that, I had a consulting company here in Omaha where we did design and development work, little shop. And before that, I freelanced. And before that, I worked at an advertising agency, and before that, I worked at a web design studio, and before that, I was a lifeguard, and before that, I detasseled. Anybody else detassel? All right. And then before that, I mowed lawns, and before that, I was a paper boy, and before that, I was a water boy for my dad's football team. And so going to Hudl, it was like full circle, so it was great. And so actually it's Hudl that I want to talk about today. It was my experience at Hudl that was really fun. So from 2016 to 2019, at the beginning of this year, that I was design director there. And I worked on both the brand side of things as well as the product side, of spanning both of those things, to try to bring those things together, right? And so Hudl has a really large design team, about 25 product designers, about 5 or so brand designers, and so a lot of different people that are touching the way Hudl looks and feels. And so it was important to bring that all together, and that was my role. So both the brand side as well as the product design stuff, what we did through our design system. So it's part of the design system, specifically color, that I'm going to talk about today. That color is important, right? Color is important in everything. I mean, it's important to our lives. Color is practical, right? It tells us to go and to stop and to be careful. The color is cultural. It makes us know who we are. Who our team is. And color is also visceral. We feel color, right? And so when it comes to software, when it comes to designing interfaces, color is the most important thing. It's the most important thing to get right. It's because color touches literally every pixel, right? And so when we're talking about building a design system, we need to make sure that we get color right. But when we were building Uniform, Hudl's design system, we did not get color right. Not the first time. Mistakes were made. So in October of 2016, I woke up in the middle of the night. I woke up in the middle of the night just in a cold sweat. And that's because I had realized that I had totally messed up this thing that was fundamental to everything that we needed to get right in our design system. I had messed up. It was on me. And that we had to completely redo color. We had to refactor things that were part of our design system, that were being used on interfaces all over the world. And so I felt like, man, it was just such a devastating thing to realize that all this trust was put on me to make these decisions about color, and I messed it up. And so now we're going to have to do all these breaking changes and change the software so that way we could fix it. And so that's what I'm going to tell you about today, is the story of how we went from having a color palette to making it a color system. So there's 3 different parts to this. First, I'll talk about how we originally created the color scheme, and then get into the problems that we made with creating that color scheme, and then what we did to fix those things. And so some things that maybe you can take away, and if you're working on a design system, or even if you're just working on color in a website too, that some of these things will be applicable. So the first bit, color scheming. So this is how we defined our color palette, right? And so we had a very intuitive approach that I started at Hudl in January of 2016, and my role was to define the design language, okay? So design language, we're talking about the color typography, and all those other illustrative things. And so it's part of our design system. So our design system is a little bit more robust than that. It's all the documentation, the style guide, as well as the technical docs that are part of that, the team that builds that, and all the tools, the sketch library, the Figma library, the other tooling that people can use, linters and things like that, as well as all the processes. That's the whole design system, right? Design systems are so hot these days, right? So initially, the team that worked on this was Michael Fouquet, who is around. Does anybody know Michael? He's an awesome guy, really smart. He'll come up later in this talk. Grant Stubland and Nick Adams. This was a small group that we were charged with the mission of making the right thing easy. We needed to make the right thing easy because over time, when you have a large piece of software with lots of different products and the way Hudl is organized, that things like this happen. This was a collection of buttons that we had that over time, that you can see how different they were, that there were some things in caps and some things that were in title case, and then the shapes and sizes, and to the point, it got to the point where you couldn't even trust those affordances anymore because they weren't, the buttons didn't even look the same. And so we needed to fix this. And the way that we were going to fix that was through creating a design system. So the process we went through was first to listen, and then to explore, and then to codify these decisions that we made. So the first part was listening. And so in the Omaha office, in the downtown Hudl office, we had a room that was, we referred to this as our wall of shame, but it was actually more of a room of shame because it went all the way around. And we used this room as like a war room to try to step back and look at everything, take it all in as we're making these big decisions of what was going to work for us. And so we used this room see everything all at once, and then we annotated it. We annotated it with what we liked and what we didn't like, and then other areas of opportunity. So we marked things up, and we understood like what it was, like the general sense of the design culture at Hudl, of like what made sense for us, what strategically was right. And we had lots of debates on what fit the right voice and tone, and what was the right personality of what we were trying to be, right? And from there, once we did this like a little bit of self-reflection, we started to explore. We started to explore what was next. And so I asked Kyle, the VP of Hudl, of what Hudl should feel like. And he said it should feel like a game uniform. It should feel fresh, clean, and ready to go, right? That's because every athlete that would use Hudl would know what it feels like to put on a game uniform. That there's like an excitement to wearing a game uniform. You pull it out and it smells a certain way, it feels a certain way. You know what it's like when it's game day, right? So we needed to establish a design language that fit that feeling, right? And so we tried to fit that feeling with the trinity of a design language, which is color, typography, and then all of the illustrated elements. Because with those three different things, those three different characteristics that you can make, that makes a brand look and feel. And so the illustrative elements is sort of a catch-all category that includes iconography, photography, illustration, texture, space, those other sort of characteristics. But when you take those three things together, color, typography, and then those other additional illustrative elements, those are what make any sort of system have a specific feel. And so with these, knowing that we needed to establish these three different areas, that it was color that was the most important, because in iconography, that we knew we were going to use it very sparingly. We were going to have just a few icons throughout the interface. In typography, that was limited too, because we knew that we needed to be very utilitarian and that we were going to use system typefaces for most of the product, that we were going to use Arial and Helvetica on the web, and that we were going to use San Francisco on iOS devices and Android, and Roboto on Android devices. So we were sort of neutralizing our brand typefaces in the interfaces. And so with illustrative elements and then with typography elements, pretty limited, it was color where we could be the most expressive. So we looked at the colors that were already established, the ones that were established in the brand. And so the colors that currently existed, and we said, okay, well, this is where we're at today, and we know we want this to be an evolution. We don't want it to be completely start over, and so we wanted to take that and then make it feel like a game uniform. And so what we decided to do is remove some of those neutral colors and remove sort of this purpley color, because it didn't quite feel where we were going, and then make those colors a lot brighter, a lot cleaner, right? Just by adding a little bit more to the cool side of things. And then we knew that in the interface side that we wanted to remove some of those brand colors. That orange was all over the place. There was so much orange going on that it was just too much. It was too much orange, right? And so we thought about it sort of like a spectrum. So like the things that were heavily promoted on the brand side, we wanted to use a lot of orange. We wanted to use a lot more brand expression. But then on the other side of things, when we are into the product, when we're into coaches and athletes actually using the product, that we wanted to use a lot less brand expression. And so it was more like this, right? And so we had these like sort of high-level things that we were playing with of like, okay, we know where we want to go with color. We know where we want to go with typography of being neutral. We know we want to use limited iconography. And so we started with a uniform fitting. And so what this was, well, one, it was a good pun with the name of the design system. But beyond that, it allowed us for these high-level characteristics for designers to be bought into the system. And so then we said, okay, take this interface, and with these sort of like vague things that we know so far about what we're doing, that we want you to redesign it. And so, okay, use these colors and use like use the spacing and how we've kind of talked about. And so these are sort of before and afters of just the first approach of what they would look like, these same interfaces, with just these few very vague guidelines. And we collected feedback from the designers to say, okay, so how are you feeling about this? What is this? How is this going, right? And so we got some feedback that said, like, oh, does this look like too much like Bootstrap? And we said, well, okay, where can we pull more and make it look more uniform? And some of the colors that we wanted to have more vibrancy, and that's what some of the feedback we got from designers. And this one, oh, it does come through. There's enough, it's the light's low that helps. I don't know if anybody, some of you might not be able to see contrast there. And that's kind of the point of some of these things in this talk. That there are some areas where we didn't pay attention to contrast and small typography of how it rendered in certain computers. And so once we had some of these decisions of this exploration, we could start to codify it. And so we understood how color was so important to different teams. And so we codified the identity colors of colors that represented something specific to different teams. And we had a limited set allowed with custom colors. And then we started to write some guidelines about like how those colors should be used, and so they wouldn't end up with these low contrast situations. And so we had the right point of view when we were thinking about color and accessibility and color contrast early on, but we just didn't quite get there. And then we had tagging colors, and tagging colors were these colors that were used so that way coaches and analysts, when they were watching game film, could quickly identify a team, that they were much more, they were like the identity colors here, but they were intended for utility purposes. Then we had our brand colors, right? And those colors were pretty solid. We were using those throughout the product. And then we had these other colors that had explicit meaning inside the product. And we did a pretty good job of naming these off the bat. And then we had our content colors. These are colors that were sort of like the neutral colors of the interfaces, and that we chose these colors with intuition of like, oh, this looks good. This is the way it should look. This feels right. And we had a dark environment as well. So we had a light environment and a dark environment for these. And then we continued to collect feedback from this large group of designers. That one of the pieces of feedback that we got right away was that the background lacked nuance, that there was going to need to be additional colors. And so we took the colors that we originally had, and from each of those colors, we added a tint and a shade. So a light color and a dark color. We added white and we added black to each of these colors. And so that our color palette really exploded overnight because we added all these colors. And so there was all these colors of gray, right? And the great thing is everyone was using our colors. It was awesome. There was like, everyone was bought in. But the problem was everyone was using our colors. Which brings me to chapter 2, the problems with this color palette. So there's 4 problems that I want to point out here. The first one is no rhyme, no reason. Second one is horrible hues, bad words, fickle contrast, and throwing shade. All right, so problem 1, no rhyme or no reason. So back to that night where I woke up, the reason why I had that moment of like, oh man, we totally messed this up, I totally messed this up, was because of a conversation I had earlier that day. I talked to a very talented designer at Hudl named Craig Young, and I really admired the way Craig designed, and so I wanted to try to understand the way he was building his interfaces, so that way we could write guidelines around it, so that way other designers could make their interfaces feel like Craig's, because it was sort of the standard of what we wanted it to be. And so I asked Craig, I said, so how do you select your colors? And he said, well, it's complicated. There were so many colors to choose from. And so he said, well, I start with, pitch black as sort of like the base, and then I will maybe select another color as like a second level, and I'll go to, the next one up, and then if I really need to boost it up, I'll go way outside of that and go with a brand color. I know I'm not really supposed to use the brand color for interfaces, but I really need a color that's brighter, that's going to be able to really draw attention where I need it. And sometimes when I need like just another color, I'll just randomly pick something from one of these other colors that are in the palette. And so that wasn't great news, because there was no way to codify the way that Craig designed his interfaces. We were relying specifically on Craig's taste. That is not going to scale across 30 different designers, right? Our mission was to make the right thing easy, and we certainly were not making it easy. It was not easy at all. And worse than that, we didn't even make it clear what the right thing was, right? That if we just added all these colors, we had all these colors to choose from, there was no right way. So it was everybody just kind of doing whatever they thought was best. That's not a system. The second problem was horrible hues, right? So we had all these colors, and these two colors right next to each other, right? They're so close. I don't know if you can see that there, but the one on the left has a lot more hue to it. And the one on the right is very dingy, right? Can you guys see that okay? And the reason for this is that we sampled and resampled. And so you can see there that the color on the left had a hue of 210, and the one on the right was, I think, 213. So they're actually different colors altogether. They weren't even the same hue. The next problem was bad words. So I would ask designers like, oh, what color are you using for that? What color, what led to that decision? So what color is that, right? Because it was kind of hard to tell because they're all gray. Whatever the darkest one, or whatever that name is, right? It was just confusing because we had all of these colors, right? And I was like, oh, you mean typewriter? No, I mean pitch black, right? We had all these names. These names were supposed to be clever. These names were supposed to be memorable. That was the point. The names were typewriter and bone slate and pitch black and midnight and white shade and clean slate. These were actual names that were part of our color palette. They were supposed to be memorable. That was the idea, is like, oh, we'll have these really memorable names. It's like you're going into Sherwin-Williams and you're picking out these colors for your... No, it was a bad idea. The only names that people could actually remember from our original color palette were white, because it's white, and the other one was non-essential. And that's because that was the only of the colors that was actually named for what it was supposed to do. And the reason why it was named that is because non-essential meant that you are not supposed to use this color unless it is for additional information, okay? Fourth problem, fickle contrast. So back to non-essential, right? So this color did not pass accessibility standards. It did not pass contrast standards. And we put it in there anyway because we knew designers were going to want this range of hierarchy when they were creating typography, right? So we put it in there anyway. We put in non-essential. But you could trust any of the other colors. You could use ink or typewriter or light type on white, and it was going to be totally fine, right? That was going to work, all those colors. The problem is once you moved up a level to clean slate as your background, well, then light type would all of a sudden not work because it didn't pass accessibility standards then. That there wasn't enough contrast there. And then if you moved up again, we would lose typewriter. So we started losing colors that would actually pass accessibility standards by changing the background color. And so it made it a guessing game for designers to know of what colors they could use or not. Problem 5. So when you take a color, you take a source color, and then you darken it, you add black to it, you end up with a new color, and that's called a shade, right? That's what I'm talking about here, so the little terms here. And then if you add white to it, then to lighten a color, then you end up with a new color, and that's called a tint, okay? And so we added all of these tints and shades to our background color, so that way we could have these subtle colors that designers needed, so that way when they were using fine lines or dividers in the interfaces they were creating. So we hastily added all of these colors. And so this added so many colors, and it created this mass of colors that we had that were all these gray colors, and that if you just saw this in a palette with no labels, even with labels, it didn't give you much meaning because those names were so bad. And so that it was really difficult. And so you would take these colors that would work together, and you didn't know which one you were supposed to use here or there, right? And so if somebody came to me and said, I need to add a fine line here, what should I use? And I would say, oh, you need a subtle line? And they would say, yeah, of course. Like When don't you need a subtle line? It's like, oh, I've got you. Use the tint or the shade of that background for that. And they'd say, well, okay, which one? I didn't know, because there was no rule to it. You could use whatever you wanted, and that was part of the problem, that there were all these colors that didn't have explicit rules. And beyond that, some of the colors didn't have tints or shades, because when you have white, well, of course, you can have a shade of white and get that really cool name of white shade, but what happens when you need the tint of white? There's nowhere else to go. You can't go lighter than white. And so it made this system that was uneven, right? And so some of the colors didn't have them. And then with the tints and shades with the utility colors, it got kind of weird too, because then we ended up with these really gross colors that were that was intended to be warning. And so tints and shades all around for everybody, it didn't work out great. All right. We're getting to the good part now, where we fix everything. This is exciting. Spoiler alert, everything gets fixed. So this is how we get from the color palette to the color system. So here we'll cover meaningful names, environmentally friendly, predictable accessibility, transparent typography, and then consistent hues. So the first thing, meaningful names. So our brand colors weren't so bad. Those colors were intended to be expressive in the first place. And so we kept all of those names the same. They made sense. They made sense to just keep those names. But with our utility colors, we did a pretty good job of naming those. But instead of keeping the same brand name for electric was the brand name, we changed that to action, because whenever you were using that color, it was intended to be for an action. You good? And then we also changed the name of success, because it wasn't always success. Sometimes it's just simply confirmation. And so now to these horrible names. So with our content colors, we decided that we needed much better names, and names that were semantic, names that were representative of the meaning of how you would use that name. And so the darkest type color, dark type, became contrast, because that was the color that you used when you needed the most contrast. And then typewriter became default, because that is where you should start. That is the first color that designers should use when they are designing with type. Start there, and then you can move to contrast if you need more contrast. And if you need less contrast, you would use the next one, which would be subtle, right? And then if you needed something that was very light, that was simply just supportive, then that's when you would use non-essential. And then for the background colors, we use them the way that Craig talked about them. He talked about levels, this concept of levels. And so we started with, okay, the basic color, white, that's level 0. That is your starting point, right? That is, you should start designing with level 0, and that is where the primary content should be. And then you move up a level when you need to create a different region for something else. And then you move up another level if you need something else. And if you really need a boost out, then you have that additional third level, which didn't exist before. And then what was really cool about this is that is how it worked on the light environment. And then in the dark environment, we gave those colors the same names. And so now we had light environment contrast, light environment default, light environment subtle, light environment non-essential, all the way through. And then the same was true with dark environment contrast, dark environment default, dark environment subtle, and all the way down. So that made it much easier. The next change we made was making things environmentally friendly. So we had these different levels, right? We had level 0 and level 1. It's a little bit hard to see. That's okay. That's okay for the background colors to get washed out. You're still using enough space, so that way division is maintained. And then you have level 2 and level 3. And so then designers knew that they would start with level 0, and that was the space for the primary content. And so they could then build interfaces with this methodology in mind, and that would start to create interfaces that felt consistent with each other. And so then there's the question of I need a line here. Which color should I use? And now it became much easier to answer that question. It was the accent of that level. Made it much easier. And so then each level then just had one accent. So level 0 had just one accent. Level 1 had just one. Level 2, 3. And then what's really cool about this is then you can actually translate interfaces from light to dark and vice versa. And so then designers are not making decisions based on what looks good. They're then making decisions on proper hierarchy, right? Proper division. Change 3, predictable accessibility. So our whole thing was to make the right thing easy. In contrast, when we're talking about accessibility, when we're talking about colors and accessibility, that's really the only thing that we're talking about. We're really just talking about comparing two colors. And so, are people familiar with color contrast and accessibility? Okay, a few of you. When you're comparing two colors, you're really just talking about a contrast ratio. So if you take white to black, that's a contrast ratio of 21 to 1. And if you take like a dark gray next to black, that's a really low contrast ratio, let's say 2 to 1. And you can do this with any colors. It doesn't have to be just the black and whites and neutrals, that there's still contrast that can be calculated from these two different colors. And so it's really just a comparison is all we're talking about when we're talking about color contrast when it comes to accessibility with colors. And so W3C has guidelines around this, the WCAG 2.0 standards. These standards are, let's say they're very dense. It's a little bit overwhelming to understand all of these guidelines, right? And so to try to simplify how it relates to color, there's really two standards that we're talking about. It's the AAA and then the AA standards. For our practical purposes, we were just focused on the AA, okay? And so the AA standards, to just understand what they mean in the most straightforward sense is that, okay, if you're designing with text on the background and the foreground need a contrast ratio of at least 4.5 to 1, okay? And then the large or bold text need a contrast ratio of 3 to 1, okay? And then for anything incidental, is the way it's defined in the WCAG spec, that it can be anything, right? So for anything else. And so to find a ratio of any two colors, there's multiple ways you can do this. One of the easiest things to do is just to go online and search for a contrast ratio checker, and then you can just throw two colors in there using hex values, or there's other tests out there. So then you add two colors to check the ratio, and then it will give you back this ratio. It'll give you back a number, and so that way you know if you're passing or not. There's also really cool tools that are built into software now. Stark is a plugin that you can actually take two different colors inside of Sketch or Figma or XD. I'm not sure what else they've made it for so far, but it's awesome, and I think there are other plugins as well. I personally love Stark a lot because Michael Fouquet, who worked on the team at Hudl, actually developed this plugin, so that's pretty cool. So our goal was to try to get to this place where we knew without a doubt that designers could just trust the system, that they could pick any color with any background and would just know that they could use it, right? That was the goal. Which brings me to change 4, which is transparent typography. This part's really cool. I really like it. I get geeky about this one. So back in the olden days of the web, we only had hex values. But with CSS3 that opened, and when browsers started fully supporting these new colors, RGBA, that added this alpha channel to colors, which made it really cool, right? So our colors and values then looked something like this. And so then we could have all of our values in this new format, right? In this newish format. It's been around for a little while now, but it now has full support, which is exciting. But what was really great about this is that we could use these colors the same, and their values, their color values, were exactly the same. The RGB part of that was exactly the same. And then we would just change the alpha channel to be able to use those colors throughout all the environments. And so we could get the colors, the essence of the colors we wanted, through that alpha channel. And so there's a couple of things that are really cool about using alpha channels for your neutral colors like this. The first one is that it actually takes on some of the background, some of the essence of what's behind it, right? So it takes on a little bit of those characteristics. But for our practical purposes, what was exciting to us when we're trying to push to this ambitious goal of making sure that it was a reliable system for all of our designers is that it also helped with color contrast. So it helped us get to this goal of that designers could just use whatever color on whatever these backgrounds and it would work. Last bit here, last change we made, was consistent hues. So we had all of these grays, right? All of these grays. And so the problem with this is that we had our source color and then would add a tint to it, right? And then would, get to this new color. And then we had added, do the same thing, and then we would sample it a second time to darken the color that we had already lightened and get to that. And so it would make us, these really muddy colors. So our source color, it was this like bluish gray, and so instead of sampling from there, we then sampled all of our colors straight from the source. So we weren't sampling and resampling, that instead we were sampling them once. So all of our colors are level 0, and then level 0 accent, level 1 accent. They were all sampled from the exact same place. And so that way we can make sure that the actual hue was the same for both of the colors. And in areas where we sampled and it wasn't quite right, we could bump it in bounds. And so that way we could use exactly the same hue for all of our colors. So we wouldn't run into that situation where if you use two colors together, that they wouldn't conflict, that they would all be across this beautiful spectrum. And we did the same with text. That all of our text was actually the same hue as the backgrounds. But with text, that we knew that we needed to boost the saturation, that we didn't want it to be totally neutral. We wanted extra saturation in it. Because when you see, this kind of comes across, that if we would have used pure white or pure black on these different backgrounds, we would lose some of the brand aspects of what that would look like as we started to bring in the opacity. So bringing it all together, we really had a system of colors that designers could use and they could use reliably. And it just made it so much easier for them because they had a true reason for all the colors that they were using. So it really was a true system of color. And we fulfilled our mission of making the right thing easy. So you can actually see all of the documentation for our design system on uniform.hudl.com. That there's so much stuff there that if you're building a design system, that it's pretty cool. And Miranda Bauk and Michael Fouquet have continued to work on the system and have built a lot more components and have contributed to the system a lot more since I stepped away from it. And so you can see that there. A few lessons from this, of what I learned in this process in working with a design system. First one is that it's so much easier to add things than to remove things. Adding colors that we didn't need meant we had to deprecate them, which meant breaking changes for the developers. And when you ask developers to make a change because there's an additional gray that we're no longer using, that you get a little bit of pushback from that, right? And so making sure that you're not adding things that you're not actually going to need. To correct early and often, it is a living system, right? But you need to do that with caution, because making a change too swiftly ended up causing us to have all these additional colors that we weren't going to need and that we eventually needed to remove from the system. Rules make things easier. I went into this thinking that designers are going to want as little rules as possible, that they're going to want some creative freedom with what they're doing, but they didn't. They wanted rules. They wanted to know the right thing so that way they could get on to harder problems. And man, getting too clever with the naming was such a pain that when getting to names that were much more reliable, that had semantic meaning, made things so much better. Color is the most important thing in an interface, and I really believe that. I think that's true because it touches literally every pixel, and getting it right gives you so much brand in essence that you can carry through in an important way. Thank you. Any questions? I think we have a few minutes. Yeah.
How did you take into account color blindness?
Good question. Well, most of the colors I talked about were gray. So Kyle Murphy, the VP of design at Hudl, is colorblind, along with, I think, like 5% or 3% of most American males, right? And so with the utility colors, we certainly kept that in that we were thinking about that. And so with other guidelines outside of just color, we made rules that anytime you were indicating something, that you needed to write it out, that message needed to come through, that you couldn't use color as the only indication of whether something was right or wrong, that sentiment, it needed to come across in language as well, or icon. Yeah?
So design systems are awesome, and they're really great when you have your own product, and that product is
Yeah.
especially when you have applications. From a WordPress perspective, when you're an agency and you're building, smallish WordPress sites and you're writing custom themes, one of the things that I've been advocating is to put together like a small form design system up front where the designers kind of, when they design that theme and they want to show it to the client.
Yeah.
Like, do you have any best practices around making a design system where it doesn't take a team of 20 designers, weeks in a war room, all that kind of stuff, where like a lone development can kind of start with a theme and say, I'd like to start from scratch, but I'd like to lay down some ground rules and then show that to a client and say, like, here's the patterns and design system we want to use, but it's a much more truncated, quick kind of thing. Do you have best practices
Sure.
around that, or like how far to go with?
Sure. So the question was basically, how do you start from scratch on a smaller project rather than something that is like this massive project where you're trying to get a buy-in from all of these stakeholders, all these people, to get them moving in this direction? And so I would say when you're working on a smaller project, especially if you're one person or maybe a small team, I think there's a huge advantage there when you're starting from scratch, especially because then you can then make all these decisions unilaterally and you can move forward, and you're not having a large team of people that are going to misinterpret what you were trying to create originally. And so I think there's a huge advantage there. I think the problem that design systems solve in these growing software companies is to keep things consistent across large teams. And as those teams scale and as there's new products that are constantly being iterated on quickly, that you start getting this like brand decay that happens. And so I think there's a huge advantage for those small teams. I think that you're able to keep things tight and that you're able to iterate on them, but in a way that is going to make sense. And then you're also able to go back and update and keep a living style guide and to keep those things updated when things change, when the brand color changes or there's other things around the brand that you're going to need to keep together. You can update that style guide and keep it living and keep it consistent.
So do you think it is valuable for small sites for clients and stuff like that, where
Yeah.
start with that and then build after?
I mean, I think it depends. I mean, that's the classic answer, right? But I think my point of view is if it's a really small project and that there's a lot of overhead to keeping a living style guide. And if you want to keep everything as lightweight as possible. I mean, that's going to be what's most efficient. And so if you're building a one-page website where you can literally see the whole style guide just by scrolling down the page, then of course, like keep maintaining something else does not make sense. But if you have lots of components that are being reused over and over again, and it's going to be more efficient for your team to copy and paste code and put it in a different place, then yeah, do that. And so, I mean, I think there's certainly a range of when it makes sense and when it doesn't. And making the decision of does it make sense or doesn't it make sense, you normally don't know until 6 months after you made that decision. So, I mean, that's the hard thing, that we made a lot of mistakes. I mean, that's what this whole thing was about, is how many mistakes we made we thought we were doing the right thing. We thought we were thinking about accessibility. We thought we were choosing the best colors that were going to be reliable, and we missed it, right? And we missed it. We were close, but we missed it. Yeah?
Are there other components or like pieces of the process that going through all of this that you are going to carry into like all of your next projects? Like I think the clever naming one is a good example, but are
Yeah.
there other pieces where you're like this change how I'm going to work in the future?
Yeah, I will certainly use, for like neutral content colors, the naming of those. I've used that on other projects since then. I think starting with default and going darker for contrast and lighter for subtle and then having a non-essential, that in every project I've worked on, having a set of those 4 colors has worked really well. I really like that. And then with that, of using the transparency with those colors, using alpha channels, what I use now instead of RGBA, I use, I'm going to get the letters